specific, and how do you know when the trickster is operating in you? How do you know when it's not doing what it needs to be doing in you? That is getting very practical in terms of marks of this kind of thing. And I've come to believe that it is enormously important for you to have the trickster really online working for you in your psyche. And let me just say in advance why I think that's the case. Because if you do not have the trickster really accepted in your psyche and working well, you are going to over-idealize too many people. You're going to be too reverent. You're going to be hyper-reverent, hyper-idealizing of all sorts of people. And you know what that ends up being? That's a giving away of your power. So if you feel weak and impotent, I will guarantee you the trickster is not functioning well enough in a positive way in your psyche, because you're giving away your power in idealizations, in idealizing projections, and idealizing transferences. So it's not that you don't need appropriate idealizing transferences, you do. And there's another side to the pathology of the trickster, that is when the trickster is on full automatic. When it is on, I see you don't know about Uzis. When the trickster is on full automatic and you pull the trigger, it just goes over and shoots everything, you know, including my legs, blows my legs off, you see. And so some of you here, I know some of you have had a little problem with the trickster being on full automatic. So if you tend to have a little problem with self-esteem, it may also be that the trickster is de-idealizing, but is de-idealizing yourself right out of existence. See? And so we will get into that a lot this afternoon, because this thing needs to shoot the right things. and the only appropriate target for the trickster's firepower is grandiosity. Pathological, infantile grandiosity. And when it starts getting into good muscle and good structure, you need to turn it off. See. So we will get into that a lot this afternoon. If that's okay with you, that's how we'll proceed. Any comments, questions about that? Well, let me just context this just a bit before we get into this. As many of you already know, I have been working on trying to develop a understanding of the deep structures of the archetypal self, which are an understanding which is consistent with Jung's work, and which does not try to do something else other than what Jung did. I understand my work is merely trying to stand on Jung's own research and trying to carry his research forward in a way that is as faithful to his meta-theoretical and meta-psychological vision as is possible. Utilizing the things that we have access today that he did not have access to. There is a tremendous amount of this research that we have available to us today in anthropology and history of religions and comparative psychoanalytic theory that Jung did not have. So I'd like to say to Jungian people interested in Jungian psychology that I disagree with those people that turn the collected works into the Black Bible. It's not a Bible. It is a source of research information of a scientific psychoanalytic theory. To turn it into a dogma means you have to shut down all further research. So what I'd like to say is what we're trying to engage in here is a continuation of Jung's own approach to the psychology of the archetypes of the deep structures of the human self. And that, I think, if you know anything about the different people in the fields, that differentiates me from a number of people in contemporary thought who are doing something else other than Jung's understanding of the collective unconscious and the objective psyche. Okay, let me read you just a few excerpts from the thousands and thousands of trickster tales. First of all, some of you have studied this material. What are some of the most popular figures in Native American mythology that represent this trickster? Give me some names. Coyote is the one that we know a lot. Can you think of others? Raven. We have Raven here today. Dan Raven. And he is one that we have to thank for this shit happens shirt. This is in the sector of the magician, when the magician is not functioning very well. But who else besides Coyote and Raven? Rabbit. It's very interesting to know that the Brer Rabbit stories come from that same tradition as hare. See, any others?
Shakespearean fool.
Yeah. Let's broaden it from Native American culture for a minute, and let's lift up other mythological motifs or figures that you think are related, or symbols that are related to this particular archetypal aspect of the psyche. What else would you say?
The Joker is not a Batman.
The Joker in Batman is great. That's great.
Roadrunner and Coyote.
Roadrunner and Coyote, yes. Nasrudin. From what tradition? Sufi tradition. Yes. Hermes from the Greek tradition. And flag that, because I want to use that later when I talk about Victor Turner and liminal and liminoid phenomena as a location for this. Hermes, the god of the threshold. See. Any other mythological figures?
Arlecchino from Commedia dell'arte, magician, harlequin.
Yes. Great. Harlequins, clowns. You see a lot of this stuff if you look at the art of Picasso. You see this figure a lot in Picasso's art. In fact, if you don't understand about the trickster archetype and you look at Picasso's art, you're going to miss a lot of what's in there in terms of insight. Other figures, yes.
Carnival, the Prince of Fools.
Carnival, the Prince of Fools. The whole idea of Carnival, Mardi Gras, and flag this and make sure I get back to it before lunch, and that is anti-structure, the whole concept of anti-structure, which is related to Carnival and these periods of time in which there is a reversal in culture. Anything else? What about Hindu tradition? Hinduism. Think of any trickster figures in Hinduism?
Narada, who plays, acts somewhat like what Angel Gabriel does.
Narada, and who else? Think about major traditions. Think about Krishna. There's much trickster stuff in the mythology of Krishna, especially the child Krishna. But a lot of Krishna sneaking around and having sex with everybody else's wives. That's trickster phenomena. You see this clearly in the Native American. Coyote is always going around, getting his penis, and it goes down. He sends it down under the lake, and extends it over there, and there's this pretty princess over there, and he has it go under the lake. Got her. See, so there's a lot of that there's a lot of that in the Krishna traditions. And actually, if you study Hindu and Indian culture, there's a tremendous amount of this energy that is available there in the culture. There's so much of a sense of play. And the whole idea in Hindu mythology of a god who is represented with lila, play, who's not all that serious. That is this sector operating. The sense that somehow there's something divine about irreverence. Now, Christians don't like this too much. In the Christian tradition, the trickster gets seen as
Judas.
who else? Judas is one. Who else? Satan.
Yeah, but there's also Christ the Fool.
There's Christ the Fool, and there's also this image of, in Godspell, of Christ, the clown figure who becomes that. But Christianity, one of the things we need to talk about briefly, we don't have a lot of time to deal with it, and I've done it in other lectures on evil, the psychology of evil. But Christianity tends to have an archetypal split in it in its concept of evil. And one of the things we might just briefly talk about today is the way in which Jung's understanding that somehow there's got to be a healing of a split between Christ and Satan. While there are some subtleties in Jung's view of evil and so forth, the idea, if you understand that Christianity tends to put the trickster lover on Satan and Christ tends to be in the fullness of, not the liberal Christian myth, but in the fullness of the Christian myth, Christ tends to be seen a lot as a warrior king, Messiah, warrior king. You can see what Jung's talking about here about wholeness. Wholeness being a reunion, and we'll get to this and lay it out for you, a reunion of the trickster lover or magician lover and the warrior king to have wholeness in the psyche. So there's some, I don't like to call that the union of good and evil, because I don't believe that's the way it should be said. Because I view evil as the splitting itself, not the trickster lover. I don't view the trickster lover as evil. I think the split is what is evil. But anyway, so we could go on, and just in this one 2-volume dissertation by Mac Linscott Ricketts, you see the enormity of the complexity of this figure in North American Indian traditions. So this is I want to lift this stuff up in the context of Jungian thought and Jungian hermeneutics, Jungian theory of interpretation. Because when we talk about something being archetypal, we are arguing that this is extremely widespread in human experience, and that it is very probably not simply personal, or simply ethnic or culturally based. It is possible to find groups that do not manifest this very much, but if you look widely cross-culturally, you will see so much expression of this that a Jungian theorist will say this is clearly an archetype. Okay, so let me read you a story or two to give you a little feel for this. If we had Michael Mead here, he'd drum and tell you one of these. Should have had some drummers come. Okay, this is the creation story. One of the creation stories of the Pueblo Indian traditions, specifically here the Navajo emergence myth. And from the beginning, coyote plays an important role in creation. Now that is a fascinating thing, because a lot of people so identify coyote with anti-structure that it's sort of puzzling to them. Why is this related to creation? But just listen to this, and then we'll have a chance to kind of decode what this may be about later. Their creation narrative has 3 parts. A journey from a low level of the underworld to the present world, that is the emergence into this world. It has a part which talks about the conditions, adjustment to the conditions of earthly human existence, and it has a 3rd segment which is about conquering monsters and conquering plagues. And you may know the work that Joseph Campbell did on the heroic twins. Some of Joseph Campbell's early work on mythology was about Navajo emergence, creation myths. Coyote is a leading figure in this story, certainly in the first 2 parts of it, not so much in the latter. But anyway, there are a lot of different versions of this, but coyote is always among the figures in this Navajo emergence story. And 3 big figures: first man, first woman, and coyote. See? So you got to kind of figure out, why that? Why is coyote there? Another thing we did not mention is Prometheus. You got to think about the myth of Prometheus, stealing, the theft of light, fire. Okay, here we go. The first 2 levels were too small and crowded, in part because Sun, who joined them in the second world, tried to make love to first woman. The third world was beautiful and spacious, and the new arrivals were told by the mountain people who dwelled there that all would be well as long as no one disturbed the water monster. Coyote did not heed their advice. There it is. Right? There's a guy that doesn't heed the advice of the elders. Right? Being curious, you get that? Being curious, he peered into the eastern waters and saw 2 of the water monster's children. He was so attracted to them, now get this, he's been told not to bother the water monster, so what does he do? He immediately goes and bugs the children of the water monster. Smart. He wraps them in a blanket, he carries them to his home. Kidnaps them, in other words. When the water monster could not find his children, he generated a huge flood that enveloped the entire third world. Well, there's Coyote. Get it? He didn't intend to have a flood envelop the whole third world. He was just doing something that he was interested in. I didn't mean to do anything. That's very trickster. You see, when the trickster is kind of possessing you, you didn't mean to cause that. I never intended to break up your happy home. That's why I love the blues. You know, when you listen to the blues, you hear somebody say, I just feel like breaking up somebody's happy home. There's up front. Boom. See. Well, anyway, the pursuit by floodwaters continued all the way to the present world. In every case, Coyote and his growing band of companions, both humans and animals, narrowly escaped the rising waters by ascending through a giant reed. Now, during their sojourn in the fourth world, a dispute arose concerning the proper roles of men and women. Now, this is an interesting one given our current situation. Each group claimed not to need the opposite sex. After quarreling bitterly, the sexes decided to separate. The women remained in the village and the men crossed the river in the central plain. And this separation lasted 4 years, during which neither group fared well. The men hated the hard work of tending the crops, and the women were unable to plant new crops. So they agreed they'd better reunite. Well, this peace was short-lived, because the menacing floodwaters began to seep from underneath the ground. Who caused that? Coyote. What are floodwaters usually a symbol of in mythology? Unconscious? What else? That's a modern term. What else? Chaos. Remember, now here's Coyote, the unwitting agent of, he didn't really mean to cause chaos, but he did. So here come the waters. The key figure in the final emergence was Locust, who successfully passed an ordeal that enabled the hard-pressed people and animals to scramble to temporary safety in the present world. Now this is a mythological theme which Mircea Eliade has made clear is practically universal. Human beings are always trying to find the solid ground, trying to find somewhere to stand. See, and get that now. The person that's possessed by a trickster has a real hard time finding any place to stand. See, hard to find a place to stand to do anything from. See, because why? Chaos is always coming and moving against cosmos. So here's the mythic struggle between cosmos and chaos. Cosmos, right order, and chaos, that which dissolves right order. Okay. Get this. This is very human. The place of emergence was in the middle of a swamp. The swamp of human history. That's very good. I like that. Suddenly the horns of the water monster surged up from below. Overcome with terror and guilt, the people opened the bundles each of them had brought with them. Coyote was forced to reveal the kidnapped monster children, and his companions quickly cast them toward their parent. Here, take them back. Appeased, the monster caused the waters to subside and swam away with his children. So, Coyote provokes the water monster, takes something that belongs to the water monster. Water monster comes to retaliate. That's your hubris and nemesis dialectic with humans. Get a little proud, take something that's not really yours, take some of the archetypal power that doesn't really belong to you, claim it as your own. It's gonna come get you. The thing is going to come get you. See? Okay. And so now the people were safe from the underworld perils, and much remained to be accomplished in order for the present world to be habitable. Now, interestingly, Coyote is both an instigator and an interpreter of the events which lead the creation to be formed more, to be gradually much more delineated and differentiated. Now, see, you got to think about that. See, what is this now? There's a very key issue. Coyote somehow can help in differentiation away from regressive wholenesses. That's one thing you want to flag. The Coyote in you can help you differentiate from regressive, simple, oversimple wholeness. See, bogus wholeness, I'd like to call it. Bogus wholeness. Okay. Initially, the sun did not move across the sky, and there was danger that the earth and its inhabitants would burn up. And it was discovered that the sun must be placated by human death. So a chief's wife offered herself as a sacrifice, and as life ebbed from her body, the sun began to move. This was the first intimation that all humans must die. Now see, there's an archetypal motif which we haven't studied at the Institute much. It needs to be studied. Jung was very interested in it. That is the motif of sacrifice. Now that's one of the most important archetypal themes, and you get it, bam, sacrifice and creation. And we can, somebody when we do the diagram should locate where sacrifice would be placed in terms of the psyche. Notice it's a chief's wife, a queen. Get it? The people were afraid of this prospect until a wise man went to the place of emergence. He looked down, he saw the dead woman sitting happily by the river of the fourth world, combing her hair. She told him that all the people of the fifth world must return to live in the fourth world after death. The wise man fell sick soon after this, and one night the moon stood still. The wise man died, and the moon continued on its nightly way. Now, Coyote, interpreter of these signs. Get that? This is more of your evidence, mythologically, that Coyote and Hermes are related, you see. Coyote taking the role of hermeneutics, interpretation. He is the interpreter of events, and so there is that role of the magician in interpretation. He told the people that just as every day one of the Navajo must die, so every night someone else, not necessarily a Navajo, must die. So he's talking to them about death. So this is the space clearly of death and rebirth in there. And again, that's the space of the magician that we'll see, as we'll see in a little bit, transformative space. So this is an example, and it's indirect, but of the connection that people often will make between the trickster and the emergence of death. And you see that in the Garden of Eden story. See? Trickster event and first death. See? This event depicts the trickster as bringing things as we know them to be in their present form. And he is an interpreter of sign. There are a lot of other of these stories which we could go into. I want to read you one more. Here's another one about the theft of fire, which is a very important symbol. And this comes from Macklin Scott Ricketts' work again. In all three of the major groups, Pueblo, Navajo, Apache, Coyote begins to yield a spotlight to more pure hero forms. And here's the distinction between the hero archetype and the trickster archetype. But and a lot of the interpreters have made a lot of this dialectic, this movement from the trickster to hero. And we'll say a little bit about, remind me to talk about Joseph Henderson's reading of that, the great Jungian analyst from San Francisco, his reading of that issue. But anyway, so there are several important events that are close to the hero cycles that Coyote participates in. One, the theft of fire, the release of imprisoned game or animals. That release from imprisonment theme is important. Release from any tyranny, see. the capture of daylight, the theft of tobacco, and even there are a few monster slayings. In every instance, the heroic side of his deed is contributed by his stealth and his use of deception. And so in these particular traditions, there's not, you're seeing a little of the heroic aspect of Trickster. And that's where you see the convergence of the Promethean aspect of the Trickster. So the Trickster is not simply bawdy and irreverent and bumbling and foolish and all these things. There's important work being done sometimes by this. See? Okay. Here's a story about the theft of fire. The only fire in the world was kept inside the village of the Fireflies, surrounded by a high stone wall. By talking with the children of the village who were playing outside the wall, Coyote learned the secret of how to enter the village. Now look at that in relationship to the God of the thresholds. See? Coyote learns the secret of how to get into the village by a tree that bends down and lifts the person who commands it. He enters. He dances with a torch tied to his tail. He ignites the torch. That's a very Coyote thing to do. He ignites the torch and he escapes. And of course he set all the trees on fire as he's running from his pursuers, right? It's our first contact with archetypal energy, right? You get everything on fire. Okay. And there's another story about how people obtained daylight that came from the Apache that has a similar account. The story centers around a gambling contest known as the moccasin guessing game, in which two opposing sides alternate in hiding a marker inside a row of moccasins. Members of the opposite team try to guess which one has got the marker in it. Because the world was totally dark at the time of the first game, this game is still played only at night among the Apache. Here's the story. The opposing sides were the large and dangerous animals versus the small animals and birds. Coyote is usually depicted as moving back and forth as each side's fortunes shift. Okay. Although Western Apaches often will portray Coyote as the leader of the small animals. And see, this is important, and you'll think about this in your own psyche. If you have a lot of Trickster stuff, you probably felt like one of the small animals in your family. See? Because if you feel real small and not very heavily armed, you're likely to develop a lot of Trickster stuff to stay safe. See? So there it is right there. The stakes were high. If the big animals won, there would be perpetual darkness. If the small animals won, daylight would result. In addition, the winners would get to eat the losers. Okay. So the small animals devise a strategy. Gopher tunnels underground to see which moccasin contains the hidden marker. And as a result, the small animals are victorious. And just as the sun begins to rise in the east, they fall upon the large animals and deprive them of their weapons, such as teeth. Some of the big animals, including bear, escape and thus propagate the species. Although Big Owl, sounds like a Chicago animal, Big Owl is killed in the melee, Little Owl emerged from his body. See? And it's due to the wish of this Little Owl that we still have some darkness. See? It would be a light all the time if it wasn't for him. See? So we could go on and on with these stories, but I want to move toward giving you a summary of some of the traits of these stories, because we could go on reading stories all day and for weeks on these things. But let me just lay out what these scholars who have focused on this stuff the most have picked up as the marks, and you want to write these down if you can, because you want to, in thinking about the psychological implications of them, you'll want to be able to take these things that non-psychologists have noted and think about them psychologically. So So let me just run through these things, and then we will take a break and stretch our legs, and then we'll come back and work more on the psychological stuff. All right. Now, it's interesting in mythology that trickster narratives are almost always series of self-enclosed episodes or adventures. Now, get this. Now, think about this in terms of mythological or narrative forms, comparative different kinds of forms. These narratives are almost always self-enclosed adventures. They're either isolated or they're seemingly unrelated fragments. Now, underline that. Seemingly unrelated fragments. Later, you can think about that. You're not going to get very orderly, long, drawn-out stories on this. Why? Because that's where you are in the psyche. See, you're in the location of fragmentation and disintegration, because that's Coyote's business, breaking up things. See, get it? Okay. These events related to Trickster usually occur within a unique context, the mythic era of the beginnings. That is, this is almost always related. Trickster stories are almost always related to what we call in mythological studies cosmogonic issues, cosmogonic concerns, world making. So it's interesting. In the place of world making, you get this little destroyer fella, this little mischief maker. And we got to figure out what that's about. We'll try to get to that and get that clear in our minds before lunch. Okay. The special relationships among the earth and mythical human and animal ancestors is never again repeated. Think. Wholeness. Archaic forms of wholeness are never repeated again after this fellow's work. So when the magical myth time comes to an end, the trickster disappears forever. So the wondrous being, the mythic being, the wonderful godlike being of Coyote disappears, and what do you get in stories later on? A degraded form that's just ridiculous. And what these scholars are trying to say is, and we'll get to this more in just a second, is that the older the tradition, the more wonderful Coyote. Not nice. Coyote's never nice, but he's wonderful. You got to get that in your mind. What is that? Unnice, wonderful. That's only a Christian problem. People that are not Christians don't have a problem with unnice being wonderful. See? But, okay. So developmental aspects. The scholars are convinced that this is a very archaic figure, very old figure in human mythology, and they have a lot of different takes on this. Some of them believe, they're all over the place on this. Some of them believe that that there was an old primitive form of a figure which was divine, but which was superseded by the high god later. You know, in mythology you get this high god that's more nice and rational and orderly and just and all these things. So they have these developmental fantasies. You know, some of the old theorists had a developmental fantasy that you had this archaic form, which was more in the infancy of the human race, and then it kind of developed. Others had an idea that there was an earlier high god that deteriorated. And so the trickster narratives then were deteriorations of what was an earlier, purer form of the high god. See, so I mean they work both ends of the stick on that. See, and it's very interesting. There is a tradition and interpretation which tends to see the development. Most of the theorists will show the relationship between the trickster and the shaman as being very closely related. And Jung, in his article in this Radin book, points out that the trickster and the shaman are very closely related, in some ways may be the same. But a lot of these scholars will say that the trickster may have been in opposition to the shaman priest. That the shaman priests were more serving this god of order And one of the things that they will point out that the shaman priest will try to get in a relationship with this powerful high god of order and be able to be powerful through placating the high god. At least obeying or doing rituals or sacrifices to it. Whereas Trickster figures will figure out how to get what he wants without placating the high god. You get it? I mean, so some of those scholars will point out this dialectic in there in which Trickster doesn't seem to be too reverent. Well, that's safe. Trickster is never too reverent. So if your religious form requires reverence, the Trickster isn't going to do it. Okay. Another point the scholars have made. There tends to be in most of these stories cross-culturally what some of them have called, Ed Piper and others have called the adversary game configuration. That there is an adversarial configuration. Most of the trickster adventures throughout the world tend to be cast in oppositional terms. And so there it is again. Whenever he is deploying his powers, he's aggressively trying to attain some individually desired goal. Or he is aligning himself with the small animals in a team effort against powerful opposition. That's a key thing. Whenever you feel yourself against powerful opposition, so he's really willing to cheat to get what he needs, get what he needs to be done accomplished. When he sets out alone against a powerful adversary, he employs deception, disguise. There's the camouflage aspect of the magician. You see it right clearly there. His ability for self-transformation, that is, form changer, shapeshifter, always in that configuration. This is behind the Wizard of Oz thing. It even includes the power to change sexes. So if you've had a little problem with gender identity, trickster stuff going on probably. And rather than writing it in some sort of concrete somewhere as to what that's about, it may well be that one is using one's gender confusion against tyrannical powers in one's life. And think about that. Think about gender politics and even the politics of gay culture and arbitrary tyrannies. And you look into that, and there's probably some sort of structural element that's going on in that. Now, this is clear, according to the scholars, very clear in stories of Raven in the Northwest, where personal rivalry with a powerful and jealous male figure is explicit. Little Oedipal stuff there, you know. Tyrannical male figures, see. And Raven can use natural objects for extraordinary purposes. Very creative. There are motifs of his smallness, his powers of disguise, disguising himself as a pup in order to gain entrance to places where he has been excluded, and so forth, compensating for lack of physical prowess with ingenuity, guile, and daring. Those are almost always present. Another motif which the scholars have said that are practically universal, defiance of natural restraints. Get that word, defiance. This is emotional stuff associated with the trickster. If you have a problem being defiant, your trickster stuff is not adequate. It's also interesting that his physiological needs are often enormous and insatiable. And he's often characterized with aggressive, very self-serving sexuality and wanderlust. There are widespread accounts of the size, the enormous size and maneuverability of his penis. And there are also many, many tales about the painful discoveries that he has to make about the limits of his magical powers and his native abilities. Even if you have the most wonderful dick in the world, there are some things it can't do. See, that's one of the things that is always a problem for the trickster. I'm going to try to accomplish everything through this. And those of you who had a little problem acting out in your lives, and you've tried to create a life by acting out, have noticed that it doesn't create a world. And this is where these trickster stories get into the issue that you cannot create structure with anti-structure. In other words, you finally cannot live your life out of this archetype. You must have this archetype, but you cannot build a life out of this archetype. And if this archetype is too powerful in your personality, you will notice something. You start a lot of things, but you never finish anything. Yeah.
This would be a good, the trickster would be a good indication then of addiction.
Lyle says the trickster would be a good indication of addiction. In what sense? I think you're probably right, but now what are you seeing there?
Is that if you're denying the addiction and saying this doesn't really exist, the trickster's going to come in through the back door and say it's going to hit you over the head with it.
Yeah, there is the aspect, the self-destructive aspect of the trickster. The trickster doesn't start out to be self-destructive. He doesn't intend, he's not masochistic in any kind of intentional way. He just starts out to do something which is logically impossible, like sitting on his own lap or something, you know. And it doesn't work. And as you say, it comes in the back. The arrogance of what he's trying to do is not evident to him, and is only evident to him after he is, like somebody said, Roadrunner, after he has fallen 14 stories or something, and is in a heap on the ground. So the self-destructive quality, and remember, see, I think that it's really cruel to the way a lot of people talk about masochism. See, I don't think people are interested in hurting themselves. And what we call masochists are people that are very self-destructive, but I don't really think they're starting out to really be self-destructive most of the time. I think they got a lot of this trickster thing operating. We'll get a lot more into examples of that sort of thing, but anytime one tries to find a place to stand in this archetype and live one's life out of it, it will blow up on you. See? All right. So there are themes that converge, many of them around defiance. And so a lot of theorists have said that the character of the trickster seems to be very, very childish or childlike. And I'll get in just a minute into some of the Freudian interpretations which really see it as childish and archaic id phenomena. The trickster has boundless energy, seems to be totally self-centered. He seems to be fascinated and involved in all sorts of clumsy experiments with his bodies and body capacities. He's just really always turned on by how fascinating his anus is. His anus does all sorts of things. He'll get his anus into all sorts of trouble. You heard of that before, getting your ass in all sorts of trouble. He puts it over here, and and it gets burned up, And then he's always trying to find it, He can't. You've ever heard of that? Somebody that can't find it with both hands? Well, this is Trickster. I'm not kidding you. It's in the stories. You have to read these stories. There's a lot of structural energy in this room today, we got to get a little anti-structural energy. Where are some of you people that are tricksters here and got to help us out, Get a little cloudy in here, But the anus is just endlessly fascinating for him, and he has no sense of revulsion for feces. In fact, one of the things he thinks is wonderful about feces is how you can smear it on everybody's temples. and on their sacred objects. And there are many stories about Trickster taking shit and just wiping it all over all the most sacred precincts. Does that remind you of any dreams of Jung's? He has an amusing kind of ignorance about the ways of the world, and they say that this conveys something of an awkward and aggressive curiosity, and in which he moves brazenly. That's a wonderful word. He's brazen. He moves brazenly from one exploit to the next. In short, he plays all the time. See? Tends to be alone a lot, but and the psychologist will say his ego functions are not developed. I totally disagree with that. Some of his ego functions are not developed. He's got some ego functions wonderfully developed. This is the Christian bias. See, they think those are not ego functions. Those, that kind of stuff's not ego function. That's ridiculous. Those are ego functions. I wish we had more people with some of those ego functions. People would kind of get amused at me celebrating the achievements of addicts and borderline personalities, because they don't think they have achievements. I think they have enormous achievements. And I think you have to get to where you can see that people who we tend to diagnose as really crazy have achieved a lot of the things that the therapist has not achieved. And we'll see that a little more clearly. Most psychotherapists have not achieved the things that the person that's dominated with the trickster has achieved.
But then it doesn't self-destruct.
This is true, if it's automatic or compulsive, but you see, what we tend to not to notice is that somebody that's got a lot of king or queen and warrior energy that's on automatic pilot is no healthier than somebody that is on trickster and lover automatic. They tend to look a lot healthier, but in terms of wholeness, if you look at a Jungian view of wholeness, they're not healthier. And they sure as hell don't have as much fun. So this is where you end up having all these envious therapists who are voyeurs of your fun. Of course, you're kind of sacrificing. You're being self-destructive and having all this fun for the rest of the staid world that you're dealing with. See. But anyway, so another motif that's central: defiance of external authority. Now that's key. Defiance of external authority. And there are others, but let's stop there for our break, because there are enough of those things which you can get a feel. You ought to have a feel for this character, and by now you ought to have a feel already for how much of this you got and how much you don't. Okay, let's take about 10 minutes, and let's start again promptly in 10 minutes. What I want to do just quickly is to talk about some previous psychological interpretations, and then I would like to locate Trickster in the psyche as I understand it, and you can even put here, like Victor Turner. I didn't talk about Victor Turner, but Victor Turner's concepts in his work on ritual of the relationship between structure and anti-structure, between structure and communitas, between hierarchical organization and egalitarian relationship is clearly evidence here. Trickster is on the side of communitas. Trickster is on the side of anti-structure against structure. Because Victor Turner, if you don't know his work, it's very important. Start with his book, The Ritual Process. Until his death a few years ago, he was the most outstanding cultural anthropologist, I believe, in the world. And right before his death, he and I were working together to bring about a rapprochement between his work on ritual and Jungian psychology. And one of the last things he did before he died was to come to a conference that we held here in Chicago at the Oriental Institute on ritual process and human adaptation, in which he, in the keynote address, he came out and essentially saying that the Jungian approach to the psyche was the most adequate for understanding the relationship between cultural and physical anthropology. You can see that essay, if you have not read it, in in the journal Zygon, Journal of Religion and Science. Body, Brain, and Culture is the title of the essay. It's October of '83. Probably the most important essay that has ever been written on this particular topic. But anyway, structure, hierarchical order in society, and communitas, anti-structure, or communitas, which is, if you go to a blues joint in Chicago on Saturday night, have a few beers, and stay a long time to about 2 in the morning, you get a sense of communitas. It's very hard to find any racism in a blues joint. 2 o'clock in the morning in Chicago on Sunday morning, 2 o'clock. It's very hard to find a racist in the room. It's very interesting. Find them, a lot of them on Tuesday, but but not on Saturday night at Blues or Kingston Mines or somewhere around here. But anyway, so let me just say, the Freudians, according to the scholars, tended to interpret trickster phenomena as very archaic and regressive, childish, basically, undeveloped, no ego structures, basically in classical terms, id phenomenon. The trickster is the id. See, and you can see why they might say that, because he's unabashed, he's not ashamed. You know, he's going to do what he wants to do and get into what he wants to get into, and he's not going to be too upset. Let's say he doesn't have a particularly strong superego, right? Okay, and they tend to interpret in that way as a kind of a regressive form or regressive phenomenon. Some of the Jungian interpretations, including there's an interesting essay by Jung in this Radin volume here, this Paul Radin volume on the trickster, which if you're interested in this, if you think you've got a lot of trickster issues, you should get this Radin book and read the materials in there about the myth, but also read Jung's essay, because he talks about it as relating a lot to the shadow. He sees it as an expression of shadow dynamics for most people, and certainly I think that is true for a lot of people. It's an expression of shadow dynamics, but you know, there are a lot of people for whom it's an expression of persona dynamics. That is, there are a lot of us, maybe some in this room, I won't point any fingers, but there are some who are in this room who are organized around this, and it's not in the shadow at all. What is in the shadow is the opposite. So it's not, I think, finally, something you want to say that this is in the shadow, because it's not always in the shadow. It's in the shadow of uptight establishment types. See?
Can it be both?
Say that again?
Can it be both in shadow and in persona, or back?
Well, unless you're very loosely organized, it probably would not be. I'm serious about that. Now, if you tend to be very loosely organized as a personality and tend to move from being straight a lot of the time, and then you go into periods of totally wild acting out for a while, and then you come back to being straight, then it could oscillate. But most of us, you know, the fact is, most of us tend not to be all over the place like that too much, except when we're really regressed. And yeah.
That sounds like addiction going on. Back and forth.
Yeah. But if an addiction is, she said that sounds like an addiction going on. But if an addiction is really is not in a state of remission or something, I mean, there is so little stability that you would never accuse the addict of being that stable. So, but let me go on here. Okay. So read Jung's essay. You can get Jung's essay, and you really ought to read that before you read anything else, I think, in Radin's book. But Henderson's book, Thresholds of Initiation, Joseph Henderson is this really wonderful San Francisco analyst who's in his 80s now, and who studied with Jung and has done a lot of really, I think, pioneering stuff on ritual and anthropology in relationship to Jungian psychology. He tended to also to take a kind of a interpretation similar to the Freudian, saying that in the personality, when this trickster element was very present and operative in the personality, that it tended to be more archaic in form, and that as you got more developed and individuated, it tended to switch more into the heroic motifs. That is, as you started to move against the chaos and so forth, that you tend to get more into heroic motifs. And I think that if you talk about the developmental patterns of someone who has really been acting out a lot, I think he's probably right. That is to say, if chaos has had a big role in your life and you spend a lot of time with the water monster, then when you start getting yourself together, you probably do get a lot more heroic energy in your psyche, and you probably do get the sword out and go after chopping that thing up and making some world out of it. So if you're thinking developmentally, that's probably right. But again, I want to point out that that is really very specific to a specific kind of person. And what I want us to do in the remainder of the morning is to talk about this in terms of what I see as the deep structure of the psyche. And let me just give a brief introduction to this, and then we'll locate Trickster in it. And I think you'll be able to see a lot of the traits that we've mentioned, how they hold together and how they function in the psyche in a more integrated way. You'll be able to hold the different components together. My work in the last 17 years has been to try to do some further decoding of the deep structures of the psyche. As I've said to you before, I have not been one that has decided that Jung's idea of the objective psyche is something that we can get past or need to get past. I do believe that the archetypal self exists. I think that it is very clearly structured. I don't think it's vague. And what I have tried to do in my work is to follow up on Jung's researches. I recommend for those of you that have not done this to get a copy of the 20th volume, the index of Jung's collected works, and just peruse through there the way in which Jung did this enormous work on researching the deep structures, the shapes of the structures of the psyche, the unconscious. Too many people today do not ever do that. They read contemporary sort of popular Jungian writing, and they don't look at Jung. One of the wonderful things I think that our institute is doing under the leadership of Peter Mudd is emphasizing reading the collected works. If you want to know Jungian psychology, you ought to start with reading Jung. And so you look in that collected works in that 20th volume, and you see all of this enormous work that he did on specific structures of the unconscious. And he did a lot on very many of them, and that's one of the things that we like to present in our program is programs on these different structures. But anyway, in that he spends an enormous amount of time on what he calls the quaternio. That is the four-sided image of the self. And one of the things that you can do when you're studying the imagery of mythology is see how often fours come up. And Jung and Jungians have been accused of having some sort of mysticism of fours. You know, the missing fourth they talk about, and Jung's fascination with the missing fourth and all that sort of thing. And a lot of people have thought that that was some sort of weird occultist mystical bias of Jung's. I don't feel that way at all. I think Jung was incredibly pioneering in getting a clarity about the fourfold structure of the self, the little s self, the eightfold structure of the deep archetypal self. As I like to tell people, the Egyptians had in their creation myth that there were four couples of gods that came in the cosmogony. In my view, that's a reflection of the double quaternio that Jung talked about as the deepest structures in which the male and female aspects of the psyche are integrated in your deepest self has 8 structures. 4 couples, like the Egyptians said, and I lay that out in a lot of the tapes and lectures that I've given. But in terms of the male psyche or the female psyche, that is what you're trying to develop, and we say our ego or our little s self, when you're trying to individuate, when you're trying to develop your mature self, there are fourfold aspects. I read to you that Navajo emergence myth. You need to get the paintings that come out of that Navajo emergence myth, either from Campbell's work on that or from some of the other works that Princeton University Press has published on those emergence myths. If you study the mythology just of the Navajo, you see it so clearly. The self is presented in sand paintings, fourfold structure, carefully balanced mandalas, fourfold structures. It's very interesting. There are in Navajo mythology there's a clear presentation of 4 snakes. There are 4 snakes, not 5, 4 snakes. And I think they were incredibly intuitive in understanding that there are 4 fundamental different forms of libido in the human psyche. Not 5, not 6, but 4 forms of libido takes. And they correspond to the different structures. My work has been to try to decode what that fourfold structure of the quaternio is. And this is what I have come to believe to be literally the case. That is to say, this is not, in my view, an arbitrary distinction. This is the twofold oppositional structure of the psyche, I think, in both men and women. I have focused most of my work on masculine psychology. But let me just lay out what I believe these structures to be. And I think if you would look at comparative mythology, at the images, look at your tarot decks, look at traditional card decks, look at the imagery of Camelot, look at the Arthurian legends, look at comparative religion, look at all sorts of sources. You will notice that there is an image of a ruler figure in patriarchal systems, king. But there are places where you can see clearly the images of the queen, including that story I read to you a while ago, the chieftain's wife. See, you have always with a ruler advisors. You see this clearly in biblical traditions, as for example with David the king, you have Nathan the prophet. See, you have Jesus the King and St. Peter. You have Jesus the King and John the Baptist, the Magus. See? And you have Arthur the King and you have Merlin the magician. You also, in mythology, if you look clearly at it, you will also always have images of the lover, Eros, the god Eros. We can go through Greek mythology on this. Zeus, what? Lover in Greek mythology. Aphrodite in the feminine, you could just say Eros for the masculine. What god for the magician? Hermes. What god for the warrior in aggression? Ares, or in Roman tradition, Mars. See. Traditional mythology, earth, air, fire, water. Get that? Earth, the body. This is the body quadrant. Earth, air, that is to say the dimension of spirit, which provides the vision of correct order, the visioning of order, of right order, of justice. The visioning, not the force. Where does the force come? This is the force. Where you get necessary force, there's not but one place you get necessary force to do anything. There's where you get it, in this quadrant of the psyche. The magician's quadrant of the psyche has interpretation. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how we're going to... Let me move this back. Yes. Can we push this out just a little bit? Well, let's see. Maybe I'm going to get off of this in a minute. But if you need to move where you can see this, because I think it's important for you to get this structure. When Jung was looking at Freud and Adler's work, he was puzzled because they discussed cases, but they would do it from a totally different way, but they both seemed to be right. Freud would work with this axis. love, eros, and thanatos, he called it, aggression. Constantly working this axis. He could interpret cases according to this axis. And Jung would say, he always seems to be right to me. Adler would always interpret things in terms of power and social interest. And the whole concept of horizontal rather than vertical social relationships. And Jung would say, it seems like Adler is always right when he does that about these cases. And then Jung said, I believe it must be a matter of typology. It must be in their perception. So one of them is this type and the other one is of that type, and when they look at the case, they interpret it according to their own typology of perception. There's probably some truth to that. But I say that's not the fundamental reason they saw different things. The fundamental reason is that there really is present in the psyche two different dialectical oppositions that are really in the structure of the self and not just in the perception of the analyst. That is to say, you can look at your personality and do a careful analysis of how you're doing on this axis, and you can do a careful analysis of how you're doing on this axis, and you will be talking about right things, and your perception, if you're very good at it, will be accurate, and you will be in a clinical case conference, you'll be able to make excellent points and back it up with evidence. But if you do not have the awareness that Jung never saw through that, he never saw through to this. And if you look at his diagrams, all the diagrams of the Quaternio, he was fascinated with them. He knew somehow they were the self. If you look in volume 9.2 of Ion, he even diagrammed what I thought I had originated. I was so proud of myself. I thought, boy, this is really wonderful. I figured out the geometrical structure of this. And so then I opened up Ion 9.2, and there it is, double Quaternio, pyramid on top of pyramid. Look at those. If you don't have that, you need to look at that. The double Quaternio is laid out in his essays on the structure of the self. He understood. He had it. He simply did not get clear about. He kept figuring out what he put. This is the Jeremiah side, and this is the Ezekiel side, and he was doing all these kind of mythical names, but he never figured out. He never was able to break the code about what the different quadrants were. And I think this is what they are. And I think if you look carefully, you'll be able to see the tensions in these things. And I think you have to have a sense of the geography of this structure of the deep self to have a sense about where the trickster is, where you locate the trickster, and why it has these ambivalent qualities, both positive and negative qualities. Because if you don't have a sense of the structure of the deep psyche, you will have a trouble understanding why he's positive and negative. You'll have trouble understanding all these different stories about him and how they tend to be integrated in their structure. But once you get a sense of what these different sectors do, or what the different programs, some of you here are computer specialists, and I get in trouble a lot with humanistic types using computer analogies. But I think they're very apt, and I think it makes a lot of sense to use computer analogies for this type of stuff, because I like to think of each of these quadrants as having very specific programs for the human psyche that either they're present and operating properly or they're not. They're malfunctioning, and they have different potentials that are radically different, and you can tell very quickly clinically, once you understand this stuff, when somebody starts describing their symptoms to you, you'll be able to tell something about what's happening with them archetypally, what archetypal system they're having difficulty with, what they are not accessing appropriately or not, and so forth. Yes?
Have you found in your studies and in your clinical work that you found that if somebody has so many aspects of the king or queen and different configurations of these things that you can almost guess or you can almost see where it's going to with and another person with a different...
That's right. I have found that not only can I do it, I have found that if somebody is given a little introduction to this type of thing, and I just say, take a piece of paper, and I want you to shade in which of these spaces, think of these as spaces in your psyche. Think, in my Father's house are many mansions. Which rooms in the mansion do you have the keys to? And you start thinking about yourself, your energy that you have every day, and you ask yourself, now, which of these have I made a beachhead on? And which of these have I not? A person with lots of trickster energy, Where have they made a lot of beachhead? Right in here, usually. All that sexuality and sensuality stuff is lover energy. See? Remember something. The reason that I don't use gods to describe archetypes is that any god has a personality, however flat. When you have a personality, you've got more than one archetypal configuration. So Trickster, the functioning that you see there is basically here, but you pick up some of the stuff where he gets the lover stuff too. All that fascination with his penis and his anus, his body stuff. The clear magician archetype doesn't have a body. It's more like Plato. The body is an embarrassment to the pure magician archetype. You think that if you really achieve development as a person in that Neoplatonic tradition, you get rid of your body. It's that Manichaeanism, that's crept into Christianity. But anyway, so where do we locate it? Here. Where do we locate most borderline personalities? Here. Let me just go over this quickly. Yeah, come around here so you can see, because I can't move this any further. Where do you get sources of order in personality? There are only two sources of order in personality. So if you're chaotic, if you've got a lot of chaos in your life, that tends to mean that you have a lot of organization here and a lot of organization here. The sources of order are here and here. This order is an order that comes from deep structures. This is an order that comes from will and action. See? If you're a compulsive workaholic, you will impose a lot of order on your life, but you will not be calm. So if the order in your life chiefly comes out of the warrior sector, you're not a calm person, but you tend to have a fairly orderly life. Not any fun, but a lot of order. If you have a lot of connection here, you tend to have a lot of calmness, peace that passes understanding. But you can't have it through identification with this. You have to have an ego connection to this sector. If you have an identification with this, you're a narcissistic personality disorder, and you're afraid somebody's going to knock you off the mountain. See? So it makes you very vulnerable to slights. You're easily hurt. You're sensitive and easily hurt. If you're sensitive and easily hurt, you probably have an identification with this. See? You follow me? Okay. If you tend to be detached, very personally detached in your life, you don't have a lot of friends, you don't really have a lot of eros for your friends. When you're honest, you admit you don't really need them. You're in this sector.